Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. He was 9 years old when the world made clear it had no use for him. His father was dead, poisoned at a Tatar encampment 2 days' ride from home, the cup of kumis still warm in the memory of the men who had offered it. Yesugei the Brave, chieftain of the Kiyad Mongols, had ridden out to arrange his eldest son's betrothal and had not come back intact. He made it home, but he made it home dying, and by the time his body was cold, the calculation had already been made by the men who had followed him. A widow, 6 children, no horses to speak of, a boy too young to lead a raid, let alone a clan. The Kiyad would not wait for him to grow. They moved camp without them. That is not a metaphor. On the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, to move camp was to take everything that mattered: the livestock, the felt tents, the mobile wealth of a nomadic people. What Hoelun and her children were left with was a riverbank, the Onon, and whatever they could pull from it and from the birch forest at its edge: roots, berries, the occasional marmot. The youngest child was still in arms. The eldest, Temujin, was 9. He survived. What that cost him and what it built into him is the subject of this portrait. The Mongolian steppe of the 12th century was not an empty wilderness. It was a fully populated political landscape, fractious, violent, and governed by its own rigorous logic. Dozens of tribes and clans competed across the vast grasslands that ran from the forests of Siberia in the north to the Gobi Desert in the south, from the Altai Mountains in the west to the forests of Manchuria in the east. The Mongols were one group among many: the Tatars, the Merkit, the Naimans, the Karait, the Jurchen. Each maintained its own alliances, its own blood feuds, its own cycles of raid and counter-raid that could span generations. The political unit was the clan, and its cohesion was kinship. A man without a clan was not merely poor. He was categorically vulnerable, outside the structure of obligation and protection that made survival possible on the steppe. Livestock was wealth. Raiding was how wealth changed hands. A successful raid produced horses and captives. A failed one produced dead men and exposed families. Women were taken in raids. Alliances were made by marriage and by the ritual of anda, blood brotherhood, a bond the steppe treated as equivalent to or stronger than biological kinship. This was the world Yesugei's family was expelled from when the Kiyad moved their camp and left his widow on the Onon. It was a world whose social logic was entirely coherent on its own terms. That coherence did not make the abandonment less brutal. It made it predictable, and Hoelun knew it. She went after the departing clan on horseback, banner in hand, and by some accounts shamed several families into briefly returning. The Secret History of the Mongols, the primary Mongolian source for this period, written by unknown authors after Temujin's death and preserved only in later Chinese transcription, records this detail with evident admiration. It also records that the clan left anyway. What the Secret History gives us of Temujin's boyhood is a sequence of specific humiliations, each one followed by a response that refused to accept what the humiliation implied. The first of those responses came from within the family itself. With Yesugei gone, the question of who led the household fell on biology. Börte, Temujin's half-brother, the son of a secondary wife, was older in the reckoning that mattered on the steppe, and he pressed that claim. He controlled portions of the family's scarce food supply and asserted the dominance a senior male was entitled to claim over a fractured household. On the steppe, a stepson inheriting a widowed stepmother was not merely possible but coherent within the social logic of clan continuity. Börte represented that future. Temujin and his brother Conqueror represented a different one. They hunted Börte down. The secret history records the episode without flinching. Temujin and Conqueror positioned themselves in front of and behind their half-brother and shot him. Börte, according to the text, accepted his fate without begging, asked only that they spare his full brother Börte, and sat still for the arrows. Hurlun's fury at her sons afterward is also recorded. It was not, she told them, an act of strength. They were surrounded by enemies and had just killed one of their own. She was right, and she was also witnessing something she may not have had a name for yet, the specific quality in her eldest son that would define everything that followed. Temujin did not accept a hierarchy he had not chosen. He did not wait for circumstances to resolve themselves. He acted at extreme cost to determine the structure of his own situation. The secret history frames the episode within the family's internal economy of survival. What it also records, whether it intends to or not, is a boy who was already eliminating rival centers of authority. The Temujin clan, a Mongol group that had once acknowledged Yesugei's leadership and had chosen not to shelter his family after his death, eventually moved against Temujin directly, capturing him, probably in his early teens, in one of the recurring raids on the family's exposed position. They put him in a cangue, a wooden collar worn by slaves and prisoners that prevented the wearer from feeding himself unaided. He wore it, endured it, and when the opportunity came during a festival when the guards grew careless, he used it as a weapon. He struck a man with the board and ran. He hid in the Onon River with only his head above the surface. A search party came through. He was spotted and then remarkably sheltered. The man who hid him was named Sorkan Shira, a retainer within the Temujin camp itself, who concealed Temujin in a cart of wool from the very leaders he served, at considerable personal risk. He eventually helped him escape. The episode is unverified by any source outside the secret history and must be understood as the Mongol tradition's account rather than independently corroborated fact. But the pattern it describes, of a man found and sheltered by those who had no obligation to help him, who inspired loyalty in people outside his own network, is consistent with everything the broader record confirms about how Temujin accumulated allegiance throughout his life. Even his captors, at the level of the individual human being, did not always choose to hold him. The alliance that mattered most came from the theft of horses. Some years after the escape from the Temujin, Temujin likely in his mid-teens, a raiding party took the family's remaining horses. This was a potentially fatal blow to people who had almost nothing. Temujin tracked them on foot for days, fell in with a young man named Börte who helped him recover the animals without being asked and without expecting payment, and returned home with both the horses and his first sworn companion, a loyalty that would last a lifetime. More importantly, the theft gave him reason to seek out Togrul, the powerful leader of the Karaite people, a Nestorian Christian tribe that was among the most significant political forces on the central steppe. Togrul had been his father's anda. He was under no formal obligation to Yesugei's orphaned son, but Temujin approached him not as a supplicant, but as a man activating a legitimate bond, and he brought a gift, the sable skin cloak that had been part of Börte's bride price when Temujin, honoring his father's last arrangement, had finally collected his betrothed from her family. Togrul accepted. The alliance was made. Börte herself was almost immediately taken from him. The Merkit people had a grievance that predated Temujin's birth. Years earlier, Yesugei had abducted Hoelun from a Merkit man on her wedding day, a raid consistent with steppe practice, but a wound the Merkit had not forgotten. Their retaliation when it came was precisely calibrated. They rode on Temujin's camp at night, took his wife and gave her to a kinsman of the original wronged party. Temujin fled into the hills with the men. The women, including his mother, were left to slower horses, and some were taken. What he did next was not what steppe social logic strictly required. A man of his position might have accepted the loss, or waited, or attempted a smaller exchange. Temujin called in every obligation he had, assembled a joint force with Togrul and his childhood companion Jamuka, and rode against the Merkit with an army far beyond his nominal status. He retrieved Börte. He destroyed the Merkit encampments. He demonstrated to every observer on the steppe that he was a man whose losses were temporary and whose reach was longer than it appeared. Börte was recovered carrying a child. Her son Yochi was born either on the journey home or immediately upon their return. The sources are tight and deliberately inexact on this point. In Mongolian, the name means guest or visitor. That is not a coincidence. It is the closest the written record comes to acknowledging in a single word the ambiguity that would shadow Yochi's entire life and complicate the succession of the empire his father had not yet built. Temujin raised him as his son and never formally repudiated him. The archive does not resolve what Temujin believed or chose to believe about that question. It preserves the name and lets it stand. By the time Temujin was in his late 20s, his reputation on the steppe had grown into something the structure of steppe politics had not previously produced. A man who attracted followers from outside his own kinship network, who rewarded competence over birth, and who had demonstrated that loyalty to him was a better investment than loyalty to almost anyone else. The alliances he built were not merely military. They were political in a structural sense his rivals did not fully understand until it was too late. He was already doing something new, constructing a network of personal obligation that crossed tribal lines and reported to him rather than to the logic of clan and kinship. It was the first outline of the thing he would eventually build. What it would eventually cost the world to build it is the story of the parts that follow. For now, he was still a young man on the Mongolian steppe, the son of an abandoned widow, the product of an education the steppe had delivered without mercy and without design. The river where his family had survived on roots and marmots ran cold behind him. Ahead of him was everything. The primary source for Temujin's early life is The Secret History of the Mongols, a document as fascinating and as problematic as the man it describes. Written after Temujin's death by unknown authors, the text itself does not identify them. It survives only through Chinese-language transcriptions made during the Ming dynasty, centuries after the original was composed. The text served ideological purposes. It was written to legitimize the Mongol dynasty and to render its founding figure in terms that combined human vulnerability with providential favor. Where its specific claims about Temujin's boyhood cannot be corroborated by external sources, Persian chronicles, Chinese dynastic histories, the later compendium of chronicles assembled by Rashid al-Din, they must be understood as the Mongol tradition's account rather than independently verified historical record. What the external sources confirm: Yesugei was a real figure, attested in Chinese records. Togrul of the Karit is independently documented. The Merkit raid on Temujin's camp and the subsequent punitive campaign are consistent across multiple source traditions. The birth year of approximately 1162 is the most commonly accepted scholarly estimate, though it cannot be established with certainty. Credible estimates range across a decade. What remains genuinely contested: the details of Temujin's captivity and escape, the specific circumstances of Yochi's conception and what Temujin knew and believed about it, the precise sequence of early alliances. The secret history is not fabricated, but it is not transparent. It is a literary monument to a political legacy, and it must be read as both. The boy abandoned on the Onon riverbank is not a figure from a remote and irrelevant past. He is the starting point for one of the most consequential sequences of events in human history, a chain of causation that would reshape the political map of Eurasia, determine the fate of cities that had stood for centuries, and produce in its aftermath both catastrophe and connectivity on a scale that still frames debates about how violence and civilization relate to each other. But the reason this particular episode matters is smaller than that. It is about what conditions produce what people. Temujin did not become who he became despite what happened to him before the age of 20. He became who he became because of it, because the steppe, in abandoning him, gave him an education in vulnerability and its uses that no comfortable succession could have provided. The question the archive leaves open and does not answer is whether what that education produced was a great man, a necessary monster, or a demonstration that the distinction was always going to be insufficient. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.